We've got a really good panel to look at the role of data. We started talking about data. There's also been discussions by some supervisors around the future role of data aggregators, so intermediaries in the market, and which role they play in financial services, and we would like to explore that with this panel today. To do so, we have with us Morten Bech, who's the head of the Innovation Hub in Switzerland of the BIS, Fabian Vandenreid, who's the Chief Strategy Officer on Greenomy, a startup company in the ESG space, and Fabian can say more about that in a moment. Nick Miller, who's Managing Director of Global Regulatory Affairs at Moody's, and last but certainly not least, Jennifer Courant, the Managing Director, TDI, Head of Sustainability, Culture and Talent at Deutsche Bank. Maybe I start with you, Morten, because I'd be interested to hear how you look at the role of data aggregators from a central bank perspective.
Well, thank you, Nicholas, and it's great to be a part of this panel. I think we look at it like other both users and producers of data. So maybe first, like just defining what is as I see, what is a data aggregator. I think it's there are of course a number of companies out there, but it's really about a three-step process. First, collecting the data from different sources. Second, processing, and third, making it available in a more readable or somewhat some summarized way. And I think to some extent, central bankers actually act as data aggregators themselves. We might not think about them as such often, but one example is the production of national financial accounts that are often produced by central banks, and they really show the financial assets and liability of countries, institutional sectors, and they built them really based on very detailed data for such as banking and pension fund statistics, and then process them either at sector level or country level. And then they provide them into international organizations such as the BIS, the IMF, and the public. So I think central bankers do play a role as data aggregators. I like to say we don't charge prices for it, so which I think is an interesting idea. But we're also very important customers of data aggregators, and we can come back to that later, perhaps.
Before I pass on, maybe a follow-up question. I would find it interesting if you just were to elaborate a little bit more on that hybrid relationship that you've just set out, as both being providers but also consumers of data. Maybe explore that a little bit more. What type of data is the data where you act as the consumer, for example, and how do you square that dynamic?
Okay, so if I can use an example, in the BIS Innovation Hub, we are working on a project to help central banks monitor FX markets in real time, and there we really want to monitor the entire FX markets. And as you know, there's a number of different exchanges around the world, and so we are basically taking that data in from a lot of different sources, something called CME, Refinitiv, some exchanges in Brazil, so on and so forth. And there we actually are a customer of a data aggregator. And why are we that? Because these are really, really high frequency data. We basically receive this data at a 5 millisecond frequency. And so when you work in that world, timestamps all of a sudden becomes like a really, really important issue. And there, like a data aggregator is really helping us making sure that the data is synchronized, so you can actually make sure that the trades are coming in the right order and so on and so forth. But then the idea is also then that we want to deliver this data or the metrics that we compute based on this data to central banks. So in that sense, we're both we're almost like a two-sided market. We are using a data aggregator to help us with the timestamping on one side, and then we actually will provide this data via dashboard and perhaps the download functionalities to our central bank customers. So in that role, we're both the user, but also basically a provider of data aggregation services to central banks.
Thank you. Maybe Jennifer, over to you. Obviously, financial institutions, Deutsche Bank is a big consumer of data. So what role does data play in the business model of Deutsche Bank, in the different applications and services provided? And how do you view third-party providers in that universe in providing services to you?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Excellent. Yeah, so data, we kind of think of data at Deutsche as really the lifeblood of how we manage our client relationships. It's key to how we think about what I would call kind of the client life cycle. So how do we operate with the client? How do we bring them on board? How do we design and develop product for them, whether that's investment banking clients or retail clients? And then I think important to this piece is the employee. So you can start to create a risk-based structure around how you manage the relationship with the client, the products you're selling the client, and the employees that can interact with those clients and products. And you create this matrix that really allows you to manage information, manage your risk appetite and your risk profile effectively. We consume massive amounts of data. We produce massive amounts of data. And what becomes key is to have as much consistency, reliability, and transparency to both the data we create and the data that we're consuming, so that we can connect it, link it, and make it an effective data asset for the bank to use. And then I think as you create that ecosystem, what becomes really important today, and I found the end of the last discussion really interesting, because how we use technology to put the information together, manage the safety of the information and the privacy aspects, but also the ability to deliver those assets into business process to help design better business strategy, and to allow our innovation teams to really think about what kind of products should we be offering to our clients. And then I think there's an aspect of it that is what I think of as the fiduciary responsibility of the bank, as well as the financial services industry in general, and how we can use the information that we have access to help the client make better decisions about, it could be their own sustainability pathways, it could be how they're managing their capital, whatever their prioritization is. This information allows us to create a better business model to influence. And I think for me, that's a big piece of sustainability at Deutsche Bank, is how can we help our clients on their pathway to become a better part of the economy and society.
I think I will come back in a while to some of the governance issues, and also earlier today, I don't know whether you listened to that, but when I discussed this with the chair of IOPA, we talked about open source versus non-open source type data. But before coming to that, Nick, Moody's of course is known as a credit rating agency, but it's a much bigger organization, and data plays a critical role both in the credit space, but also in you providing data services to other companies. Maybe you'd like to elaborate a little bit on that, and how do you see the role of data aggregators, and maybe already some of the public policy implications arising from that?
Yeah, sure, Nick, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be able to speak at this conference, which I think is very timely. I mean, I think, absolutely echo Morten and Jennifer's comments. I think it's increasingly difficult to be too prescriptive about categorization here. So a firm like Moody's, you're absolutely right, Nick, global risk assessment firm. We are gathering data from all sorts of sources. So we have, an AML KYC business gathering data globally on beneficial ownership, for example. We are gathering data through our RMS business, which is a climate, does, for example, climate catastrophe modeling, lots and lots of data points from the physical world and how, climate change is affecting the physical risks that companies are out there facing. And of course, through the credit rating business, which we're famous for, we're gathering tons and tons of data around, credit risk and issuers and the risks that they face. So we are gathering lots and lots of data, But we're also creating data at the same time. So it's not just a case of aggregating data and sending it out there. It is about us creating data. For example, a credit rating is clearly brought together on the basis of a methodology. It has analytical input, has engagement with issuers, has discussion in a rating committee, and so on. So we're also producing that data. But I think the challenges of this vast quantities of data that we're all having to work with, which is now so fundamental, so embedded into how capital markets work and how financial services operate. What is really challenging is to gather that data together, be confident that the sources are reliable and accurate, and also just the normalization of the data, the cleansing of the data, bringing it together in a way that's meaningful for clients. And then on top of that, often you're adding an analytical overlay. So you're not just seeing the data, but you're actually seeing something that allows you to make meaningful decisions, meaningful risk assessments, for example. And all of that requires, talented people. It requires time and resource. It requires capital investments and so on. So it is a complex business, but it's absolutely critical to, the future of financial services. It's bringing great efficiencies. It's bringing access to a range of data points that weren't readily available before, and it's allowing much more refined and sophisticated risk analyses than we have had in previous years, and that's all incredibly exciting. But given the importance of data and how it's becoming part of the life cycle of financial services, no surprises at all. And I speak as a former regulator when I say this, that it's no surprise at all that regulatory bodies, public authorities are looking at how data aggregation works, how reliable it is, how sustainable it is, and how in terms of the resilience of the operations as well. So I think lots to look at there. There's a number of challenges, I think, and again, one of the things we've been saying is let's be really clear about what we're concerned about, what the harms are, because there's a vast array of potential issues out there, and I think if we're going to solve regulatory issues, we need to be really clear on what the kind of regulatory harm is that we're concerned about.
Thank you, and we will come back to that in a while to see what the public policy implications are of effectively every regulated financial institution becoming a data warehouse, processor, supplier, and then, as you say, the added value services on top, the judgment, the actual added services. But before we come to that, Fabienne, you're kind of relatively new to the game, so to speak, as a company. You're kind of a startup company getting into the data space for the financial service industry. I'd also be interested in your initial thoughts around the function and role of data aggregators, such as Greenomy.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and good morning, everyone. So indeed, Greenomy is a EU-based RegTech specializing in ESG taxonomy, data management, and regulatory reporting. So what we do typically is codify regulations into data models, and then helping, in our case, corporations, financial institutions to comply with their regulatory obligation or their voluntary actions that they want to take as ESG is concerned. So we've built several portals where we go and get data at source from 50,000 corporates in Europe that have or will have to upload ESG data for reporting to regulators. So that I think lots of what has been said already about the challenges in terms of consent. Consent is very important. If you go at source asking data from corporation about their CO2 emission, but also other factors about social inclusion, governance, you must make sure that that information, which will be shared with various stakeholders, got the consent of the originator of the data. That's quite important. And the learning we have, but it's very specific on ESG, is that a lot of those corporations that needs to capture that data need a lot of help, especially SMEs. It's not always obvious to understand what kind of data point you need to capture. So I think there is a role for a data intermediary, a data aggregator, to also support and help the less sophisticated participant in the ecosystem to actually participate in this data sharing. That's the first thing. The second aspect, to me, we also provide portals for lenders, credit bureau and banks to get ESG data from all the corporates with whom they are engaged in a loan. So you can imagine the work of aggregating all that data and how financial institutions consume that data and share data among themselves. It is also, from a governance standpoint, I know we'll come back to that, a very important point in guaranteeing fairness, transparency, and some reciprocity also in terms of exchanges. And maybe to finish off right now on this, I'm an ex-SWIFT, so I've worked all my careers on interoperability and standardization. What we see today in the world is that there are probably 20, 25 countries, regions developing taxonomies, ESG taxonomies. FCA will release one hopefully this year. So guaranteeing or making sure all those taxonomies talk to each other is really important for global banks and global corporates as well, to avoid having to rekey 10 times the same information in different formats. I think it's also an important learning at this stage.
Thank you, Fabienne, for this opening kind of set of comments. I think before looking at some of the public policy challenges, I would like to drill down a little bit more on the opportunities and the use cases of data. Each of you has, in a way, already started to talk about that and allude to it. But Morten, coming back to you, where do you see the real opportunities for third-party data aggregators in interacting with public authorities, or in your case, with central banks? Where do you see a real gap or need that they can fill or are filling for you?
I think that the gap that they are filling is really around skill sets that they can provide us with some capabilities that central banks or regulators do not have. So to allow central banks and regulators to get access to a wider range of data sources, and in particular, as I mentioned, in the case of these timestamps, like really provide their expertise as a service, or as we heard from Fabian, central banks are also very interested in the green economy and ESG. So, but we don't have the necessary expertise. So I think that's where third-party aggregators can help quite a bit. And then I think just in terms of issues around scalability, there's so much data out there, and just being able to manage that. And I think there's some big synergies, economies of scale and scope of actually having a third party help you managing that.
Thank you. I mean, Jennifer, you kind of started talking about how access to data helps you, supporting your clients in driving innovation, driving efficient processes. Where have you seen this in action? And also within the bank itself? I guess it's not only for your clients, you must have also seen it in the bank itself. Where kind of do you see the use of increased data really making a difference?
Yeah, so it's really, I think, in a multitude of areas. If we focus on some of the topics that I think Nick brought up, when you have access to all this information, whether you've created it, you're bringing it in from vendors and aggregators, and you have good people building good models that is enriching that data, you can then use it to, and we've done this as we've built more advanced risk appetite models so that we can understand the risk appetite. And we've spent a lot of time talking about kind of what I would term as client or party data. But there's a lot of data that we're also bringing in, whether that's weather data, coastal data, satellite data, that's allowing us to marry kind of the location of our client base, our collateral base, and really understanding the impact to how we would price that risk. So you start to really cobble the information together, build analytics on top of it, and really allow yourself to create a better opportunity for the client, but also to protect yourself as a bank and protect shareholders, shareholder value, and the deployment of capital. And I think that marriage of kind of risk-based analysis with delivering value to the client and to the shareholder is really what bringing this information, whether it's carbon emission data from our clients, with weather data, with flood pattern data, really allows us to, I think, be a more comprehensive bank. And it's where I think the relationship with the regulatory bodies is really important, because I think that kind of thoughtful, measured innovation in analytics, partnering with our regulator, will help us make better choices for the economy that our regulators are trying to protect. And I think you need that kind of, I think of it as collaborative innovation and opportunities to fail within a safe space so that we can really learn from the models. And I think we talk a lot about AI and the implementation of AI in some of our models, but it's never done without good quality, transparent data and good quality people who understand the math behind the building of neural nets, for instance.
But maybe to drill down on that a little bit more, Jennifer, because as timing has it, tomorrow the European Parliament and its committee will vote on what we call the Data Act elements. And the Data Act, or the purpose of the Data Act, which was mentioned many times over the last day and a half, is in a way to create a legal framework that allows parties to share data. But this raises interesting questions, as you say, about how do we within such sharing of data ensure that the quality of data is accurate, that it's sufficiently standardized, that you can use it without creating or recreating systems that needs to bring it in, and you make it usable, as Nick said. It's part of the challenge is to just bring it into a format that can be used. And thirdly, also maybe already looking a little bit on the commercial side of things. You say you take weather data, you take data from different aspects. Some of that is public good data, but a lot of it, of course, ultimately needs to be paid for or might be proprietary. I'm throwing a lot of questions at you, but it'd be interesting to get your first sense of how, in developing your models and identifying the type of data, your thought process. Is it data first, model second? Are you thinking about the model first? See what data you need, and then you negotiate your way around the system to find the data that is most accurate, reliable to facilitate the model development.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and to dig into it, I can speak kind of personally as well as how the bank thinks about it. I spent the early part of my career as a modeler. I'm an econometrician by training and trade, and spent a lot of my career at Citibank building probability of default models for our corporate loan portfolio to effectively mimic the credit ratings that Moody's or S&P produce and allow us to understand the likelihood of default across the portfolio. And I don't think working with data and building analytical applications of that data is very different today. You need to understand your data, putting it into a set of equations, mathematical models, what have you. If you put garbage in, you're going to get ineffective results out. So really making sure you have the most transparent, good quality of the right granularity or comprehensiveness across the problem you're trying to solve, and really making sure that the problem statement and the business case, the associated business case solution are very, very clear, because that will help you as the analytics person find the right information and data. Now, you're right. There are a lot of complexities when you start to put things together. For instance, if you marry geospatial data with a loan portfolio, you start to really personally identify a house or a building. And that brings in some ethical questions that I think a lot of what the Act is starting to think about, right? So I think it has to always be data first, and you have to have a deep understanding of your data before you start to dump it into models. Now, when we think about neural nets, machine learning, or any kind of artificial intelligence model, data is really important there too. And you see some of the ethical questions that are coming out of the implementations around GPT in some of the Microsoft products. So I'm curious what my colleagues on the panel think. I think it has to be data first. You have to understand what you're working with, and the math comes next.
Thank you. Maybe, Nick, the same question to you, because, as you say, you've accumulated significant data sets over time from different entities, different areas. And there's, of course, always the tension about your own data and using your own data, but also bringing in third-party data. You know, there's a bit of a kind of the collective action problem. Ideally, you want everybody's data, everybody wants everybody's data, but there's also, of course, a certain proprietary element to it. How are you squaring this? And again, the same question, the tension between data first, modeling second, or vice versa. How do these two things fit together?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I mean, I think I absolutely agree that you have to have accurate, reliable data, and you have to be confident in the sources of that data. And that is, that is a continuous challenge, and something we take very seriously, obviously, as we're producing the various products that we do, because it's critical that the information you have is based in reality. I think the challenge becomes not just about the sources of the data, but how they're being compiled, how they're being aggregated, and then importantly, the decisions that are being made out of that data, given the models that are placed onto it. So I think here, in terms of the sourcing of the data and the availability of the data, this is where global standards can be quite useful in certain regards. So, for example, in terms of carbon emission disclosure, really important that we get a consistent approach to that. I think one of our panelists mentioned the taxonomy, so really helpful to have, as to the extent possible, a globally consistent taxonomy, and that allows you then to compare apples with apples. And what it also does is it removes the risk of frictions between different data sets where they don't quite match up properly, and you're having to make assumptions, and when you're making assumptions, that brings in risks of errors and so on and so forth. So I think we are absolutely supportive of global efforts in this space with the ISSB and others to ensure that there is a global baseline for some of these disclosure standards. And you also just need to be, I think, realistic about what can be achieved by a given corporate in a given time frame, because some of the disclosure standards that are being required now, with perfectly good intentions, and the ambition may well be absolutely right, but nevertheless, it just does take time to produce good quality disclosures that are robust and that can be, for example, verified externally and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot more work to do there. I think one of the things about the challenges here is that ultimately people are going to be making judgments off the basis of this data. So I think data is not, it can never be the complete answer to everything. I think you can present a set of scenarios, you can present a set of facts, you can run analytics on top of it, but ultimately people are going to have to make judgments and decisions about which projects to invest in, which funds to invest in, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, there will always be an element of human judgment at the end of that decision-making process, which is, absolutely right, but it needs to be done on the basis of, safe and sound data to the extent possible.
I'd like to come back to that maybe in the next round of discussions about public policy implications, because there's talk about bringing certain more mechanical benchmarks or criteria into regulatory frameworks where judgment might or might not be included. So the role of judgment there is critical. But before doing that, I think, Fabienne, in a way, I mentioned open source earlier, and in a way, you said you want to go directly to the source of, let's say, corporates to collect information. How does that square with the issues of points that we just discussed around, for example, data quality, consistency, comparability? Because in a way, by you stepping in a step before the others, one could say, you expose yourself potentially to more risks along those lines.
Yeah, I think getting data to source is the hardest way, right? It's also the way that is preferred by regulators. And I think in terms of data quality, it's very important. The mindset is very important. If you ask a corporate to upload hundreds of data points for regulatory reporting, they will have to do it. Sometimes they don't know how to do it, but if the mindset is that we are helping those corporates get quality data because it will be the baseline to start their transition journey, to understand where they are good or less good than other corporates in certain areas, then you change the mindset completely. It's become a collaborative project with the corporates on top of being just another regulatory reporting project, if I can say so. But data quality is a challenge, simply because in ESG, we're talking mostly about non-financial data, which are everywhere and nowhere in the organization. They might be in an ERP system, they might be in an HR database, they might be in board minutes, they might be in CSR reports. So data acquisition is a big challenge. And that's where I think collaboration between data providers, data intermediaries is the way to go. Nobody has all the data. So there are best of breeds islands of data between the existing providers and new providers like ourselves. And I think to get to that data quality, you have to have a second level of control or assessment. In our case, we have an auditor portal where the auditors of that corporate can provide an assessment on the completeness and quality of the data. But also for the corporates, it's important, I think Morten mentioned it, it's a production consumption role for everyone. So if a corporate produces quality data and everyone is doing that, then the benchmark you receive, the peer benchmarking, the analytics that the corporate will get back from the ecosystem will be of high quality as well. So it's very important to have that clearly communicated with the corporate. And then I think that there's lots of talk about open finance, data hub, data sandboxes. I do believe in collaboration between existing and emerging data provider. And I think for specific use cases like ESG, where data is fragmented in many parts of the organization, but also many providers, having a sound process to create data sets together for the benefits of the regulators and the corporates is something that I'm really looking forward to look into, not only data, how you can combine data, but then from a business model standpoint, indeed, everybody has to make a living. How do you create business models that are fair, transparent, vis-a-vis the corporate, and that can scale over time? Because I think we'll have more and more in open finance. There's a good report from OECD on that. There will be more and more collaboration between data providers, public and private. And I think this notion of a data hub sandbox, for the lack of a better word, is welcome from our perspective.
You raise a number of really interesting points, Fabienne. One is, I think, the tension between kind of provision of data seen as a compliance function. So in the non-financial reporting space, I think that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment. It's seen primarily as a legal mandatory requirement, and flipping it over into what is the incentives, what is actually, how can it be used to advance a company's strategic orientation and planning is very interesting. But the other point you raised, which I think is very interesting, is in a way the tension between transparency and proprietary interest. Because in a way, if you develop an interesting model, you want that model to be used by other players in the market. But the moment other people understand your model, they can replicate your model or try and seek to improve your model. So there's a clear tension between the two. Morten, maybe talk, we're starting to move into the public policy space and some of the risks, starting with you kind of being our regulator at the table or public authority at the table, so I kind of pick on you first. Where do you see the challenges in your case, central banks using aggregators? What do you have to bear in mind when you do rely on them?
I think Nick and Jennifer might already have touched a bit on it, but really this thing that the data needs to be reliable. The previous session discussed, should we trust in God or code? I think we could all agree that we need to be able to trust in data. So I think that's a new way of looking at it. But I think in terms of reliable data, somebody that comes from the regulatory side, there's a trade-off with timely data. The BIS provides statistics on the FX markets, but we only do that in every 3 years, and we collect the data in April and only publish it in the fall. So I think this thing about, but we also do a lot of work on trying to make sure that the data is reliable. So reliable is really important. And then I think the data aggregators need to be adaptable, especially in financial markets, but also I guess in ESG and green, where things are changing rapidly. So they really need to be able to adapt to new circumstances, and unfortunately also changing regulations. And then of course the service needs to be secure, and we need to make sure that it's not tampered with. Some of these data you can trade on them. They are, you can make money off them. So there needs to be a secure element. But there I think technology can help. And then of course the cost. I think we want to make sure that there's a competitive market for data aggregator, so that the costs are reasonable for people such as central banks and others that are the users of them.
Maybe follow up, because if I summarize some of the things that have come out of the conversation so far, it is that it's very hard to define what is a data aggregator. Everybody is a data aggregator for themselves and for others. Now you set out some minimum standards, and we talked about those also already, about reliability of the data. What do you think should be the public policy response? To be very provocative, the French markets regulator, the AMF, together with the Dutch market regulator, the AFM, came out with a paper last year thinking that data aggregators should be supervised, should be licensed, similar to benchmark operators or credit rating agencies. But I'd like to hear your views about that, and the questions around, we've heard often, are they the new FMIs? Will data aggregators be the new financial market infrastructures? And therefore, do we need kind of CPMI-style standards around this? How should we deal from a public policy perspective with this? Or kind of maybe more benign, we look at as a decentralized approach, different ICT providers that fall under DORA and operational resilience requirements, and just need to meet certain minimum standards about the quality of their data, otherwise they get crowded out of the market. How do you think policymakers should look at these new animals?
No, I think that's a really big question. I had the pleasure of working with the CPMI for many years, and there we came up after the great financial crisis, as you might remember, that we had these trade repositories, and one of the problem was that they started out without the data models actually being interoperable, and so CPMI and IOSCO spent years trying to fix that problem later on. So I do think, like, in terms of I actually think data models are public good. So they're non-rival, non-excludable, and something that where just like standards, where the public sector can help not write them, but facilitate the generation of appropriate data models, and I think that would be helpful. I think how much regulation that needs to be around it really depends, I think, on the nature of the data. I would hope that in many of these instances, existing regulation can cover it, like around fraud or market abuse. But I'm not precluding that there is a need for certain types of data for there to be regulation.
Thank you. Maybe Nick, over to you also as a former regulator. If there were to be a regulatory framework around this, at some stage, you already made the distinction between elements based on judgment compared to the underlying data sources. And you and Jennifer talked about elements of standardization and other kind of, the arrangements for the governance around data. Where would you see potential scope or need for public policy intervention, if at all? And what might that look like?
Yeah, I think it is indeed a big question, Nick. Thank you. I think look, you've got to look at firstly what we mean by data, right? So data is not homogeneous. There's different types of data. There's some of it is value-added data, some of it's basic information. But again, to my first point, I think I made is bringing all that together, normalizing it, making it usable, making it interoperable, all those good things require, capital investment. And what you don't want to do is to disincentivize companies from making that investment, which is over the long term often and requires, ongoing surveillance and maintenance and so on. So I think that's the first point I would make. So it does speak to the need to be just really clear about what are the types of harms you'd be concerned about from a regulatory perspective. And there are absolutely lots of concerns you could possibly point to. So the risk of fraud, market abuse absolutely is there, the risk of cyber attack, the risk of data being disclosed, the risk of resilience failure to provide a service on a continuous basis, a lack of backup, and so on and so forth. You could create any number of harms that would be quite perfectly valid to be concerned about. But I think when it comes to the question of regulation, you need to tread quite carefully in this area. Not to say that there's no role for regulation here at all, but I do think it needs to be quite targeted and quite well considered, thinking about, what are the types of risks that are really going to be meaningful and that you're concerned about from a perspective of, the integrity of capital markets, for example, or consumer confidence in the security of their data, for example, and how best to achieve that. Because oftentimes you'll find, I think, that the incentives of senior management and boards of data firms, data aggregators, call them what you will, are likely to be aligned with regulatory concerns. There's no incentive for low cyber controls, for example. So I think what you do need to ensure is that you're creating that accountability, that engagement at the board level across senior management as well, to make sure that the investments are being made appropriately and that they're being challenged in an appropriate way as well. It's not just as simple as saying, this is, we create a set of rules and you must abide by them. Is that you might be able to do that in certain aspects of financial conduct regulation, for example, but it's just not going to work in this area, I think. So thinking about what are the kinds of harms that you're concerned about and where best can regulation help to minimize those and resolve them, recognizing that in this area it's not going to be zero failure. There will be issues, there will be systems outages and so on, and in those cases you're not trying to prevent those completely, but what you are saying is, do you have appropriate backups? Have you thought about continuity planning? Have you thought about tolerance for disruption to your clients, and so on and so forth? So it's a complex piece. It's not going to be done I think in one step, and I think the supervisory elements of this are really interesting because ultimately, financial regulators are increasingly scaling up in terms of data and so on, but that's not been their core remits traditionally. So a change of mindset, change of focus at the regulators, I think, is going to be important. And I know that's being looked at the ESA level and within the national competent authorities and so on and so forth. So lots more to do. I think there are lots of challenges, but it's a very interesting and exciting area.
Maybe I can just follow up with two small additional questions. One is maybe a comment, because I think you make an interesting point that there is a lot of regulation already out there that covers things. The AI Act regulates use of that. Data will be there will be certain standards that apply, operational resilience and so on, that are sector neutral and will apply to many of these providers. And I guess many of the issues, depending on what the problems that are being identified, can already be resolved by some of these horizontal pieces of legislation. But what role do you see for the governance within the data aggregators organization? So within your own organization, if we look at board structures, for example, chief technology officers, risk management within the own organization, how is that evolving as the company becomes more and more reliant on data and internal and external data for its business models?
I mean, I think it is a constant evolution, and your governance framework, Moody's governance framework, is evolving as the challenges become more real, as the risks become clearer, and so on and so forth. And I think it is about ensuring that you have the right skills, and that retaining that skill set can be expensive. Let's be clear about that. That's not but it's really important that we do that we are continuously learning from best practice in terms of risk management around operational risks, for example. It can be a challenging area to conceive of, because what are your thresholds? I mean, you cannot, it's not realistic to set 0 failure across the piece. That's just not going to be a manageable way of, a manageable level of tolerance to enable your business to run appropriately. It's just not realistic. But what are your tolerance levels? What are your backup plans? How have they been tested? Are they being challenged robustly at the board by, for example, non-executive directors who are, sufficiently, they don't have to be, Google Cloud engineers necessarily, but they need to have access to enough expertise and experience to challenge the executive appropriately. But again, it's not going to just be I don't think you can write a single piece of legislation or a single, delegated act or whatever it is and say this is the problem done. I do think you need to look at all of the different pieces. And then when you're looking at operational risk in particular, really drill down and be clear about the kinds of concerns that you've got, because it's not going to be possible to solve all the potential issues that are there through one intervention, and particularly given that, to your point, Nick, there are lots of other directives that are kind of attack this space. So what is it that you're concerned about, and what is the best value add that you can bring to this area? Obviously, recognizing that you need to be proportionate and recognizing that risks will occur and manifest.
Thank you. Maybe Jennifer, building on this, you made a really interesting point, Nick did as well, around the supervisory relationship. So the relationship between the financial institution and the supervisor needing to feel comfortable with what a financial institution is doing in the data space, model development and other areas. You also, I think, made a really good point, if I don't misrepresent you, is that we see a lot of, let's say, specific use cases emerging. So it's not a universal thing. There's a problem to be solved, and parties might come together to try and solve that problem. And that brings us to something that's very common across this whole conference: increasing partnership between third-party providers, technology providers, data providers, and regulated entities. So maybe you can help us unpack a little bit, how you see the relationship with third-party providers in this space, but also how you see your own relationship with your supervisor as you're exploring the use of new data-based models.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and to dig into it, I think the relationship between third-party providers and the bank is somewhat nuanced, right? As we work with our own data models, how we're thinking about describing our data landscape, our client life cycle, and kind of the evolution of our use cases of data, whether that's building out a data strategy around data culture and architecture, quality, lineage, et cetera. All those aspects, and some of them have business applications, some of them have they're risk and regulatory based in nature, particularly lineage and understanding what we've done to our information as it flows through all of our application stack. I think having that kind of open dialogue with the third party vendors and aggregators is really important, because we need to figure out how to translate it into, in some cases, very old application stacks, in some cases, very antiquated ways of doing things, antiquated business processes, especially as banks, and not particularly speaking about Deutsche. I've spent a time at other large globally systemic institutions. We are in a process of transformation ourselves as financial institutions, and in some cases we are very cutting edge, and in some cases we are behind. And as we bring our application and our data landscapes to more modern standards, so many banks are going through cloud transformations, whether that's public or private. These are all key aspects that I think the third parties in some ways need to help educate us as we go through these transformations, and learn from them, because they may have very specific use case learnings that we can apply across the entire kind of estate that we're working with. And I think the relationship with the regulator is important. I think we have the opportunity as the financial institution to use data in new and interesting ways. And as long as we have I think what is a very open dialogue, I think we can help build a much kind of, I guess I think of it as a future proofing to the financial economy as we move towards it. And I think we're going to have to do that. And what I saw out of the back of the 2008 financial crisis was an increase in knowledge in the regulatory bodies. Folks that have been working in industry went into regulation, right into regulatory offices, and really helped them understand that industry perspective. And it's almost like when you have ethical hacking and you have hackers who have gone onto the other side, we can really learn from each other. And I think banks are much more taking seriously their fiduciary responsibilities, both to protecting the economy, but also to, talking about some of the social aspects, but our ability to increase diversity and inclusionary behaviors in leadership are also really important. And I think when we think about the safety and soundness of the financial economy, that relationship really does need to evolve. I think there are banks, though, and Deutsche is one of them, who has been improving their relationship with their regulator off of a history of complicated topics. And I think making sure that we, as a financial institution, reflect on that and reflect on our own learnings is really important to show that we want to be better. Our CEO talks a lot about getting better at getting better. And I think that really is what we want to show, not just our regulator, but our clients and our partners.
Thank you very much. And I'm conscious of time, but Fabienne, maybe just closing with you. When we spoke before, you talked a lot about the importance of public-private partnerships, the sharing between public authorities and the private sector when it comes to data exchanges. Maybe a few thoughts on that to close us off.
Yes, and I think I'll build upon what Jennifer just said. To me, what I've learned so far, helping corporates deal with ESG data capture, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's really depend on the size of the corporate, the sector they're in. There are some sectors who need much more speed in transitions than others. And so I think it's very important to have an open feedback loop with the regulators who created the taxonomy and let them know very concretely, this works, this doesn't work. Those data fields, nobody knows how to capture them. This is okay. This is okay for that sector. This is not okay for this sector. So creating this bilateral exchange is really important. But I think the regulator, and I'm talking with my ex-Swift hat experience of lots of development, they need to know where to stop in prescribing the technology. I think we need to have a common understanding and a common operational foundation with to guarantee everything that Nick and Morten have said, so quality and consent and everything. But I think data is also today the biggest source of potential innovation, and for sure, if Europe wants to get one step closer to the industrial Green Deal, this will require a lot of innovation, and that innovation will require a lot of data. So I think we need to be careful not creating a mindset where people are afraid of sharing data or are just doing this as a checkbox exercise, and making sure that there is place for data innovation, which can be public-private, by the way. Because let's not forget that in my case, ESG data is just the starting point of a full transition journey where there will be a lot of innovation. And we need to make sure we have the right transparent data, but there is room for, some data corporates don't want to share too broadly. They might be okay that data is anonymized and part of a sectorial benchmark. They just don't want the full raw data ESG to being shared left and right without their consent and without them knowing who is going to use that data. So it's as usual, it's a public-private partnership is something we need to look at, balancing the need for innovation with the need to have a fair and transparent data ecosystem.
Yeah, and it brings it back to the point you made at the beginning, I think, which I liked, about creating the right incentives for people to share rather than just forcing them to tick box, and thereby the overall quality standards and so on will break down and create friction in the system. Thank you very much to all of you. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. I apologize around not having a coffee break per se, but please do step out at the moment you find there's a certain part that is less interesting for you, or just bear with us for a bit longer. I think this was extremely worth it and interesting, and this will be an issue that will come back to us. I think it will be a huge issue for the incoming Commission over the next 5 years from 24 to 29, and therefore we wanted to also start looking at this already now. With that, a big thank you to Morten, to Jennifer, to Nick, and to Fabienne for a really excellent panel. Thank you very much indeed.